started, it is a real pleasure for me to introduce James Lindholm, who I was calculating last night I've known for almost a quarter of a century. We went to graduate school together, and talk about how you can take your PhD and take it in wildly different directions. It's remarkable to think that we have the same PhD, but really have gone into very different areas of research. James is the James W. Rote Distinguished Professor of Marine Science and Policy at Cal State Monterey Bay. He's trained as a marine biologist and as a conservation biologist. He has a PhD in ocean conservation from the Department of Geography and Environment at Boston University. After his PhD, he did a postdoc at the National Undersea Research Center at University of Connecticut, and then he worked at the National Marine Sanctuary Program in Massachusetts. His research covers a number of different issues, including the landscape ecology of fishes, spatial approaches to marine management, including marine protected areas, design and monitoring, and also the ecological effects of bottom trawling. In 2007, James founded the Institute for Applied Marine Ecology at Cal State Monterey Bay, and he directs the institute. James has been the chief scientist on 66 oceanographic research cruises and projects at sites around the world, ranging from the eastern and southwestern Pacific Ocean, the Gulf of Maine, the Mid-Atlantic Bight, the Florida Keys, the Indian Ocean. He's conducted 5 saturation missions to the Aquarius Undersea Laboratory in the Florida Keys, and he's also piloted a one-person submersible at 150 meters in the Gulf of Maine. James's work is really straddling the science, marine ecology, and also policy. He's really at this forefront between management and science policy making. He's been to the White House to help draft executive orders. He's briefed Congress on the science of marine reserves, and he regularly participates in briefings in California State Capitol. He has extensive experience using acoustic telemetry, remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, occupied submersibles, and essentially he's put years of his experience playing video games, which I can attest to any Donkey Kong or Galaga experts in the room. He's basically transferred those skills to operating his ROVs underwater around the world. So please join me in welcoming James to FES.
Thanks, Karen. All right, let me escape. All right, I can't escape. Sorry? Oh, there we go. Thank you. While that's happening, I will say on video games, it is true that about 4 years ago, when we had an ROV, we were on an 11-hour ROV dive, and the controller that was controlled by a joystick shorted in my lap. I didn't get electrocuted, which was good, but we were concerned about the ROV being in the water, and the engineer went downstairs into the hold and came back with a Nintendo Game Boy console, and we flew the ROV with that console for the rest of the day. That's a true story. I called my mom up right away after and said, "Look, Mom." So anyway, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come speak to you. I do a lot of different things. What I do falls under a big umbrella. Most of it does occur at this interface of science and policy, which I understand many of you are considering or are already doing. It's a very exciting and challenging area to work. It's also very unclean, frustrating, maddening in many places. So what I'm going to do today, I thought, would be, I guess, over the course of about 35 minutes, make a pitch for a particular type of data collection in the context of that science policy interface. And then we can talk a little bit about that. So, all right, let's get to it. Real quickly, the type of work, I'm going to show results of a variety of different projects, both finished and ongoing. Lots of support from a variety of different state entities, a lot of federal entities, and then, of course, private donations. So I think to scope this, we really need to start with 3 things I learned as a federal employee. The first of which, for all those of you who are thinking about working in the future, is this one: I don't work well with the boss. If I understand this is being live streamed, so Craig, if you're out there, there's no disrespect to you. It just, the fact of having a boss was not something I responded well to, whether they're good or bad. Other things I learned, though, were remarkable. So I was working in New England up in the Gulf of Maine, was this extraordinary disconnect between academia and the government and the federal government. Now, I think that's probably changed. This was true 15 years ago. It's probably improving now. But I think many of you may have already, if you haven't already experienced it, you probably will. The well-intentioned, thoughtful, scientific endeavor undertaken by faculty and graduate students and undergrads directed towards the resolution of some ecological truth. And then there's what the federal government is doing on a daily basis. So I was a research coordinator for, at the time, one of the 12 national marine sanctuaries. And I would come into the office in the morning with an agenda for the day and have that agenda go out the door when a call came from Congress, and everybody's redirected towards something else. So a lot of that really well-intentioned science, really good stuff, the culmination of years of work on many people's parts, went up onto a shelf and never saw the light of day again because it didn't bear directly on what I was doing at any given moment. And that was hugely impactful for me. And so my career since then has really been dedicated towards trying to smooth the transition between science and policy. The other thing I learned that was important was in a vacuum in which science is not being absorbed in the way that we as scientists would want it to be absorbed, the answer is not just more science. It's actually more nuanced science. Now, this isn't exactly the election year to talk about nuance, I understand. But in the Panglossian best of all possible worlds, there is a scenario in which we're able to make decisions that are a little bit more nuanced, and I think we need science to support that, and that's another thing I'm going to talk about today. So the question then becomes, where does that nuance come from? What types of data can we collect to support a more nuanced policy, either temporally or spatially or all of the above? And the pitch, what I've been involved in since my postdoc days, is the use of visual tools. So these are non-extractive tools that unlike many other ways of collecting data, much of which we know historically in the undersea world comes from things like trawls. You tow it along the bottom, you dump stuff out on the deck, you count things, you measure things, you cut them open. You get to hold animals in your hands, but one, they're no longer part of the ecosystem, and two, you kind of miss some of the fundamental ecological relationships between those organisms in the environments from which you just extracted them. Visual tools, I think most importantly, put scientists in situ. I think probably most of you are terrestrial, and I think we all in the marine world have a great terrestrial envy because, as bipeds breathing air, you're allowed to go out into your ecosystems and collect data. The marine environment, we're not similarly endowed, and so it's much more challenging to get anything like the sample sizes that you want to do the types of analyses we need to do. And these tools do a reasonable job of putting the scientist into that environment. And an important point, too, is they collect imagery rather than data. When you come back from a dive with a data sheet, there's useful information and a lot of good science that comes from that, but you can never revisit those things, whereas images serve as a permanent archive from which additional questions in the future that we can't currently anticipate are something we can extract from them later, and I think that becomes really useful. So what I'd like to do is do a little bit of a tour of the types of things, the categories of stuff that I've been working on. And one to start is just getting back to this fundamental ecological relationships. A colleague of mine from Marine Conservation Biology Institute used to just analogize a collection of data in the marine environment. If we did it the same way on land, it would be sampling in a forest from a helicopter in a fog. You drop your net down and you tow it through the forest, you bring it back up, you get at the squished end of the cod end, there's some flowers, there's a hummingbird, there's a couple squirrels, and maybe a couple branches. You do it enough, you're going to start to maybe draw some kind of correlations, but you miss the fundamental ecological relationship between the hummingbird and the flower. The image-based stuff allows us to place organisms in the environmental context in which they occur, behaviorally as well as spatially and temporally. So an example of this is a project I worked on a number of years ago as a postdoc, looking at Acadian Red Fish. So this is one of the 3 rockfish species in the North Atlantic. And all we really need to focus on here is that we observe this and we're able to demonstrate an ontogenetic shift in their habitat use. Their habitat use changes over time. When they're small, if you're a small fish, there are a number of things that want to eat you, to be perfectly honest. Every single day you need to find your own food and avoid becoming the food of something else. And when you're small, the interstitial spaces in these piled boulders left by the glaciation provide extraordinary number of hiding spots. But as you grow, you exceed the capacity of the little interstitial spaces, and we found them move off into these serianthid anemones. So these are tall tube anemones, like 14 centimeter tall anemones, and they grow in these dense forests, oftentimes around the perimeter of these boulders, and they provide a great deal of habitat as well for a fish a little bit, 11 to 20 centimeters in size. 21 centimeters plus, those fish have what we call a refuge in size. For those of you who have any biological, ecological training, you know that most organisms in the environment are constrained by what they eat for their gape size. And so when you're a redfish and you're bigger than 21 centimeters, you can avoid most predators. Although one predator, of course, humans, did a great deal, impacted these guys significantly. The story I've heard was that in the 70s, this was your filet-o-fish sandwich. And it's no longer the case now, and the redfish are coming back. But this is an expression of a fundamental relationship that as the organisms age, the different habitats they use, we wouldn't have got that from many traditional approaches to collection of data. In the marine environment, we tend to favor hard bottom, charismatic mega habitats, things with big reefs with lots of organisms, but sand habitats are also interesting. This is the silver hake out on George's Bank. This is a sand wave that created by tidal currents or storm-driven currents. And what we found in this project, also using visual tools, was that silver hake were selecting for sand waves of a period appropriate to their size. So if you're fighting bottom currents, if you're seeking cover from predation, your goal is to minimize the amount of energy you allocate at any moment. And sand wave of a particular size is going to facilitate that. And we found a strong association between silver hake and sand waves appropriate to their size, and interesting day-night utilization based on those size behaviors. Again, just another example of how organisms use demersal habitats or benthic habitats in the marine environment. But going out to California, and I'm going to talk about mapping in a little while, but there are new habitats that we discovered, or newly discovered habitats called rippled scour depressions. So one of the things that happens in the marine environment is we tend to think of the continental shelves, independent of rocky reefs, as this kind of unrelenting, low relief sediment. It's sand, it's shallower, the deeper you go, it's more depositional and muddy. But in fact, there are these rippled scour depressions that are sand wave fields, frequently associated with other reefs, but we've mapped them all up and down the coast of California, and the same grain size, so this is immediately outside of a field, and all these little things protruding from the sand, those are brittle stars that have buried themselves and stick a single arm up. And that, this is habitat for one type of species, but in the rippled scour depressions, you have juvenile fish of a number of different species, some protected, that are using these RSDs as habitat for this critical juvenile stage once they've first settled out of the water column to the seafloor. And these are habitats for which we never really understood before. We manage sand to the extent we manage sand at all. We manage it as the same way. So this paper that our graduate student did set off a new direction in research and management that we really have to consider the sand in a different way than we did historically. Okay, so in a nutshell, we've demonstrated some relationships between organisms and the physical and biological attributes of the seafloor. Another dimension that image-based analysis helps us understand is the way in which those habitats are impacted. And the focus of much of my research over the last 20 years has been looking at how trawls impact the seafloor. So I think we all probably agree, without even having done any of this research, that trawling impacts the seafloor. You've probably heard it. You probably might be of the opinion that they destroy habitats. I will try to avoid normative terminology, but I think in an orthodox interpretation of this is that trawls, when you drag it along the bottom, alter the environment. Whether they alter it, they may destroy it relative to the perspective of a single focal species, but in a broader context, they just alter it. And the question then becomes, is the alteration something that we as humans favor or not? And that's more of a policy decision than it is a science one. But what I was interested in is understanding the context around which trawling, like many other environmental measures, are considered within the suite of other possible solutions. So I live in Monterey Bay, where desal, against the backdrop of a major drought, is an important consideration. But what you see is each of the desalination options being dismissed on their environmental merits. But nobody's really talking about the bigger trade-offs. We have to have water. And this desal may not be great because of this impact, or this desal may not be great for that impact. But the reality is we need water. And what we're failing to consider the broader trade-offs. So what we've been trying to do with respect to trawling is, rather than demonizing a particular gear, spending a little bit of time to understand the context in which trawls impact the seafloor, different trawls, different levels of intensity, and different habitats, to flesh out somewhat in a marine spatial planning context how we might better allocate the use of these tools so that continue to use them, because there are some organisms that are extractable only by trawls, and to do so in a way that minimizes impact on the environment. So very briefly, we've done things like work out on George's Bank in different sand habitats. We found out on the outer side of the bank an interesting thing again, that below the 60-meter isobath, there were habitats and sponges living there that were persistent and were vulnerable to the impact of trawling. And after 4 years, we could find a signal in the inside and out of a closed area demonstrating an impact from trawling. Shallower than that, shallower than 60 meters, the annual storms, the 6 nor'easters that would come through annually would reformulate the sand anyway, so any anthropogenic signal was lost. And so right then, one of the emergent properties of this study was that deeper than 60 meters, persistent habitats that you might want to manage differently than shallower 60 meters, even though the grain size is held constant. In the western Gulf of Maine, we've looked at a variety of different habitats, piled boulders, gravel. This paper dealt with these two. We also have deep mud basins, these deep blue areas, and sandy areas. What we're finding here is that the story is complicated. This is an area, obviously, that has been trawled, that has literally been hammered for hundreds of years in various ways. And it's still difficult to flesh out an anthropogenic signal because the natural background environmental variation is so considerable between habitats that anthropogenic signal gets lost. Back out here in California, we started a project looking in an area in Northern California just to look a first pass at the continental shelf and these kind of lumpy, shelfy habitats, lots of biogenic mounds and depressions created by other creatures that fish use as habitat. And we found clear and distinct differences. So in each of these papers, we found clear differences, we published it, and we got a lot of attention because of a demonstration of an impact. The next project I did, though, off my hometown of Morro Bay, California, we worked with the Nature Conservancy, which had done this innovative program in Morro Bay where they bought all 10 of the trawling leases and took over one of them and kept fishing. The Nature Conservancy, not the group you'd expect to see be in the trawling business, were operating the last trawler remaining. So we were able to use that trawl and direct the trawling to specific areas and specific intensities. And what to encapsulate it is, with very little exception, we were not able to find a difference between high intensity trawling and low intensity trawling and controls. So here we trolled the heck out of the bottom at 2 different intensities and could not find a signal, which was really instructive because these habitats are consistent with much of the continental shelf. This narrative doesn't jive with our bigger understanding of trawls' impact on the seafloor, and ironically, I spent much of my career being yelled at by the fishing community for doing anything related to trawling, and this project got me yelled at by scientists and NGOs and many other groups. The fact remains that this is, it's a single study, and we're doing more, but the fact remains that putting our eyeball on the seafloor via an ROV was able to quantify aspects of fishing's impacts that have eluded us through other types of tools. And I think that alone is really useful. So we fast forward to what we're doing now. So we've tried different intensities. Now we're trying different types of gear. So over here you have a kind of traditional trawl. And with a traditional trawl, the entire trawl is on the bottom the entire time that it's being dragged along the seafloor. There are doors on either end holding the net open. The lines connecting the doors to the net are impacting the bottom, and the entire front of the net is being dragged across the bottom. And you can see continuous contact here. And most of the net is obscured because of all the sediment that this thing is kicking up. The fishermen, working with people from the Pacific Northwest, have modified the foot rope so the foot rope sits off the bottom a little bit. And fish are able to avoid it, and you're also not impacting the bottom nearly as much. So what we set out to do was to say, okay, what's the relative contribution at the same level of intensity between these two gears? This is still ongoing, but what we found, so looking at three major attributes of the habitat, these crested depressions, these are depressions with kind of a rim around them, flatter depressions, and then biogenic mounds. We compared the two different gears, so with respect to both modified and traditional gear resulted in a diminishment of these habitats, but the difference, the percentage difference change between the two is pretty remarkable. The same was true for depressions and for mounds. We also calculated the amount of fuel consumed per gear type per toe and found that there's a clear relationship between the amount of fuel expended and the impact to the bottom in this case. So there's this nice ratio that we can, the sweet spot that we're working on this paper right now, to articulate where you want to be with respect to the fuel consumed and impact to the bottom. Again, the scientists aren't responsible for making any of these decisions, but this is the kind of science that can allow management an opportunity to consider something other than an outright ban, which is something that we see much of the time with respect to trawling, and I'll return to that in a minute. Okay, so another attribute of the environment that challenges us are these extreme habitats. Some of the piled boulder reefs that I talked about before aren't trawlable by habitat, aren't surveyable by trawls. Another category is canyons, and we have a number of canyons off the coast of California, some that come right up to the shore. This is Southern California, San Diego area, La Jolla. So this is the Scripps Canyon, these are the La Jolla Canyon, two deep water canyons that come right up to the shoreline. You can scuba dive off the beach and swim out and dive into the head of this canyon. These both have been enclosed within protected areas within the last 3 years, but sending an ROV up the canyon in a traditional approach became intractable because the walls are so steep that the tracking we use to maintain position on the ROV would get whacked out. We'd lose position of the ROV, which ended up being very dangerous. So we created new elevator transects where we reoriented all the cameras and just go up and down the walls. And we bin the data into depth bins based on what we understood about the species. And we're able to look at how the species community changes up these vertical walls, which is information that we'd all intuited historically, but we never had any quantitative data to talk about what the fish communities look like as you change depth along such a steep depth gradient. And a brief summary, we found that shallow, both canyons kind of shared the same complex of rockfishes, which was not entirely a surprise. But as you got deeper, the canyons differentiated. La Jolla had more rockfish, some flatfish, and then other animals we just characterized broadly as elongated bottom dwellers, eel-like things. Whereas Scripps Canyon in the deep was dominated by these small dwarf rockfish. This is the group half-banded. Now these two canyons are just kilometers apart at basically the same depth, and the communities are very different. And that's an emergent property of just looking that we hadn't seen before. And so I think understanding these extreme environments, and we spend a lot of time in the marine world managing for things, representation, resilience, various other attributes, but we don't think about rarity as much. And characterizing habitats that are unique or partially so is also really important. So moving on, if you took I spent a lot of time with ROVs or bottom cameras driving transects over the seafloor. And the reality is, if you accumulated all the work that I've done over the last 20 years, and then you took all the people I've worked with and over the entirety of their careers, you'd still have basically a very small total footprint of area transected. And in a management context, that creates some challenges because we don't really haven't historically had a way to take the relatively small areas that we're sampling and extrapolate to anywhere else. And mapping has become a vehicle for doing that. So if we look real briefly at the march of progress in mapping, 150 years ago, you had lead lines, which gave you a sounding in fathoms, and you basically knew what the depth and maybe something about the sediment type. As time marched on, we were able to get through bottom grabs. This is an interpolated map from several bottom grabs at these points. Progressing forward to the age of acoustic technology and multi-beam, you get an interpreted multi-beam map, which is the marriage of both the depth sounder as well as a measure of the acoustic backscatter, and then interpreted with small video and still photographs. So you get now the resolution of the habitat in which you can sample and or manage is dramatically increased in a relatively short period of time. This opens up a whole new area in marine sampling, and the advancements have not stopped there. If you look at a map from California, where we now have the entirety of our state waters from the shore to 3 miles mapped in relatively high resolutions. This is 5-meter horizontal resolution. One of the challenges we face is that there is this continuous area right along the coastline in white, which is not mapped, and that's limited by the proximity of the research vessel, how close it can go to shore, particularly in rocky environments. So a colleague of mine who was a major player in the state mapping project decided to try something new. And I think the term unique is thrown around a lot, but in this case I can use it in its truest sense. What Rick decided to do, my colleague Rick Kavitek, was put a sonar head, a $100,000 sonar head on the back of a jet ski, and figured he would fly that jet ski into the nearshore and map things. But it turns out, if any of you spend any time on a jet ski, when you put a $100,000 sonar head on the back, it becomes very unstable. So he then figured out, okay, what I'll do is I'll place that jet ski in an inflatable, and that will stabilize it. And in fact, it did. Now it's not going to, it won't flip. Well, I guess it hasn't flipped. It won't would probably be ambitious. But the jets didn't work. So he took a cue from the Florida Keys or the Florida Everglades, and he put an airfoil on the back. And now we have something called the Kelp Fly, and only he drives. There he is, looking good behind the wheel of the Kelp Fly. But this tool is he can fly in. Now, it takes a lot of effort with a single vessel just going back and forth like this, but he can map the nearshore in a resolution far better than the 4 meters that we have offshore. The resolution is such that you can see kelp canopy at multiple different levels. You can see the major canopy and the understory kelps, all because the resolution is so high. Now, only he drives it, and there's only one of them, but this represents the kind of forefront for where mapping can go. And this mapping, again, enables science. It enables science directed towards management, and it ultimately enables management as well. So let's look at some of the things. So what we're able to do from these maps, and many of you have probably done this kind of analysis in terrestrial stuff, you have your GIS layers. These are all attributes derived from attributes of the map. And we throw these into GLMs, and we can talk more about the analytical approach if you have questions. But we accumulate a variety of attributes of the seafloor and throw them all into analysis. And then we do our transects. And this is a Bodega Head in Northern California. The green lines are ROV transects that we did. The yellow points are, in this case, brown rockfish observed. And what we're able to do is modeling based on those attributes of the seafloor to predict where these animals are going to go. And that gives us an opportunity to extrapolate well beyond the relatively limited area transected in green here to characterize, in this case, high suitability is in red. These are the attributes where brown rockfish seem to like, at least a Bodega Head. Now, this opportunity to do this kind of work is extraordinary, and we are only starting to do the kind of analyses that will get us towards the ability to better manage. And what I'd like to do is talk about a few examples of those. So Canary Rockfish, for those of you who aren't familiar with rockfish species, they're very long-lived. There's depending on how you characterize them, maybe 100 species in the North Pacific, a few in the Atlantic. Some of them are very long-lived. They mature late. They're vulnerable to fishing. So Canary Rockfish is one of those. It's been characterized by the National Marine Fisheries Service as a threatened species. So again, this is Bodega Head. The red boundary is a state marine reserve. That's the highest level of protection the state provides. It's a non-extraction. You can extract nothing from in there. The blue is a state marine conservation area, and then you can see the topographic map underline it. So what we did, what a grad student of mine, Heather Bolton, did for her thesis was to map a variety of species, this is for canaries, at different age cohorts. So young being 10 to 15 centimeters, and 15 centimeters or better, mapped their occurrence in the ROV transects, and then predicted where they'd be, and then looked at that inside and out of the protected areas. And what she found was that the most restrictive of the types of reserves at Bodega Head are only capturing 9% of the young and 4% of adult habitat, whereas the state marine, the conservation area, does a little bit better job, 71% of adults, 49% of young. Now, whether these numbers are good or bad is independent of some political context, is not something we would venture to comment, but it's information that allows you, if you are thinking about evaluating these marine protected areas with respect to their behavior and their protection of particular animals, this is one way to do it. And this is demonstrated in this case. The way the marine reserves were placed, using the best science at the time, they weren't optimized, obviously, for the placement or the protection of canary rockfish. Another species of great interest in California, both recreationally and commercially, is the Ling Cod. They are large. In the Gulf of Alaska, they get to be 6 to 8 feet long. Down our way, a big one is more, maybe 5 feet, and they're not nearly as massive. But what a grad student of mine, Megan Bassett, did was look again at this ontogenetic habitat use. So year one, you see green is suitable in this case. The small ones like the sand. As they mature, they start to move into the higher relief, and as adults, they really favor the higher relief rocks. And these are ambush predators for the most part. They sit on rocks and wait for something to swim past. They don't exert a lot of energy swimming a long time to capture things. So what this did was it gave a spatial context to the same ontogenetic habitat shifts that we'd done with redfish back in 2003, but now we understand what that looks like coast-wide. It allows us to look at, for instance, so here's the peninsula again, the suite of various management measures. So essential fish habitat, which is something that occurs under the Sustainable Fisheries Act back in 1996. It requires protection of any attribute of the seafloor or the marine environment that helps produce managed species. Rockfish conservation areas, both trawl and non-trawl, were closed by the Pacific Council. And then in yellow, we have the state marine protected areas. What, again, in a spatial context, we're now allowed to do to look and say, okay, what is the percentage being captured by each of these management measures relative to the different age cohorts of particular species, in this case, Ling Cod? Again, the answer to whether it's doing a good job or not is really a subjective one. It's depending on the policy whims of the day. But this allows us at least to have a conversation that we historically weren't able to have. And that, I think, has great utility. Another thing we can do is start to think about, Karen and I were talking before the seminar, what do you do with respect to climate change? And I'm not been working explicitly on climate change for much of my career. However, given that I have an archive of video extending most of California, California extends from 32 degrees north to 42 degrees north, covers a great deal of latitude. We can now, in this case for Ling Cod, extrapolate to the likely preferred habitat from Ling Cod at different age courses over the entirety of the coast and start to make predictions about how we might expect that to change as water temperature changes and other attributes of the marine environment change with climate change. Again, this is somewhat of a loose connection at this moment, but as long as the imagery exists, it will allow us to revisit fundamentally what are Ling Cod at different ages doing at different positions along the coast, and what were they doing historically? What were the communities they were associated historically? What do their associations look like today? And I think that is going to provide us with an opportunity to discuss the baseline against which climate change's impact can be measured. So coming full circle to what we started at the beginning, more nuance, not less. Central California is one of the most protected seascapes. I don't really like that word, but colleagues use it all the time. We have a lot of federal protections, we have a lot of state protections, and we have a number of private agreements organized to provide spatial management of different areas of the coast. And two questions arise. A common one is everywhere protected? And there are many people who like to argue that. And another question would be, should everywhere be protected? And that's an entirely different discussion. To the first question, I had a group of grad students back in 2012 do an analysis of 51 managed areas that overlap the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. They ranked each according to a relatively simple model evaluating the conservation value of the particular management measure. So these are management measures from the state and different federal entities, all superimposed over the boundaries of a national marine sanctuary. What we found was less than 1% of the sanctuary is actually protected at a high or medium high level. that was not pleasing to the sanctuary that supported us in this work, but it was a kind of a frank assessment of an answer to this question: is everywhere protected? It is true that everywhere within the boundary occurs within at least 2 different types of managed areas, but whether that comports or results in any protection is an entirely separate question. And without doing spatial analyses to kind of think about that, we can't really answer those questions. And so when you're sitting around a U-shaped table in an ugly hotel ballroom dealing with management and a lot of antagonized stakeholders, you really, driven by data, the discussions can be much more informed. And that allows us to have more nuanced discussion. The other point that I want to bring up to kind of bring it to conclusion is why I think these image-based approaches are so important. And that is primarily, one, because of all the various attributes I think they provided, which have been demonstrated. But another thing, if you think nationwide, 2 major initiatives, one for the last 15 years or so, has been these integrated ocean observing systems, putting instrumentation out there that solves most of our problems. And I think this type of instrumentation provides all kinds of vital information, but not the types of stuff that I was talking about today. So investing, when we think about our federal investment in the types of data that we need to support management, this is only one category. It won't answer all of our challenges. It doesn't address most of what I've talked about today, which I hope I've made a little bit of the case that those are information that are really important for management. The other issue is that the biggest, latest thing, at least in the marine environment, is this idea of citizen science. Not spending nearly the amount of money. Why pay academics or professional people to go do science when you can have the public do it for free and get them engaged? And that's many management agencies I've heard talk about this openly, and they aspire to it. And in terms of engaging stakeholders, I think this is an invaluable effort. But I think we have to really think about whether this is the only approach. We tend to cling on to things that are new and exciting and probably over-apply them. And the point I want to bring up here is that citizen science isn't going to get you sampling of the deep ecosystems that make up 77% or more of California's waters. And many of the instruments that are put out there are also not going to collect those type of data. So when thinking about answering questions for management, you really need to think about matching the science to the technology and the budget, obviously. But I think we need to keep in mind, not unlike the arguments that are transpiring in the space program, occupied science in space versus instrumented science in space. There are those that argue all instrumentation all the time. Others say there's still unique attributes that we want to have human eyes on scene to do so. And I think I would like a case to keep a visual component of sampling the marine environment going. And with that, I will bring it around and take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions, and we bring up the lights, and we have microphones. So, wow, terrific. So if you keep your hands out, we can get the microphones to you.
Okay, let's start here.
I don't know who was first. Oh, sure.
Okay.
Hi. So I'm curious. Oh, is it? Oh, sorry. My name is Grace Ravel. I'm a first-year MEM student here at the School of Forestry, and I'm interested in marine policy issues.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in your investigation of your predicted areas for populations of these fish, if you cross-checked that with any of the fishing records historically with the fishermen to see if those were identified. And then the selection of the area for the marine sanctuaries is probably a reflection of political interest in that area for economic reasons.
Right. So a couple of things. So the first point, one of the challenges of much of where I sample is that there is recreational fishing data, although it's hodgepodge. So much commercial stuff has been done in habitats where they don't work in those areas because, when you're towing a $100,000 net behind a boat, did my mic just go up in volume? Okay. You don't want to tow those areas. So there isn't been perfect correspondence. But one of the things that some colleagues of mine are working on right now is developing a visual tool that will allow them to sample quantitatively in a way that's equivalent to the National Marine Fisheries Service trawl surveys, so that they can sample these habitats that are not accessible by trawling, so you could make the precise comparisons you're talking about. And to your second point, many of these protected areas are compromises. The boundaries are compromises. In many cases, the goals have no relationship to the protection of certain, the National Marine Sanctuary was not set up to protect rockfish, right? But people's expectations evolve over time, totally independent of the initial designation. And so this provides us an opportunity to start to think about what's happening within those boxes that we've drawn on maps, whether or not that was part of the original designation or not, if that makes sense. This guy right in front of you had a question earlier.
Hi, I'm Santi Sindel. I'm an MEM first year here. I was wondering if you've looked at how using these ROVs is affecting, I guess, the behavior of the fish underwater. You're putting this machine there.
Cut this guy's mic off right now. Yes, thanks. I'm sorry to interrupt. That's a very good question. And it's one of those things that I think it's a challenge that we all talk about and face. I've done a few calibration studies, both with SCUBA as well as different types of ROVs, and clearly there's impact. An ROV is driven by thrusters. The thrusters make noise. In deeper environments, we're using lights that don't occur naturally. So we're blasting along, and clearly the animals are impacted by that. Some tools are quieter, still have lights. SCUBA has bubbles, rebreathers have no bubbles. So there's a variety of exchanges. And what I think we've tried to do historically is, for behavioral stuff, we try to note what the animal's doing at the moment of first capture. So the first opportunity to see it, which gives us the best shot to analyze before the vehicle's really been upon them. And then the other thing we try to do is calibrate and understand the difference between tools. The problem is that we don't deal in this best of all possible worlds. So we have to use the tools that are available to us. And so basically understanding the types of concerns you're talking about I think we better couch the results understanding what possible influences there could be. For instance, when we were sampling canaries, we didn't see as many large adults. Were they not there, or was their primary avoidance escape when the ROV came through? So these are questions we talk about in the discussion. But in terms of calibrating and planning for it ahead of time, it's a little harder, because much of the work is done with whatever tool you have available to you, if that makes sense. Okay, question over here.
Hello, my name is Ishan. I'm a first-year master's student here in environmental science, and I had a marine biology bachelor's degree as an undergrad. Cool. So when I did my undergrad, one thing I've heard constantly is that sampling for fish is constantly accountables, because they move, they swim away. And based on my limited understanding from your talk, is when you launch those ROVs into the water and take pictures or shoot videos, to me it's easier to look at the landscape or the benthic vegetation, but for the more mobile vertebrates and fish and other critters, they move around. And I'm just wondering how you can make sure that the slowly moving underwater vehicles can actually capture and not double count, or like to sample them the right place, the right time, and then when you move to the next plot, it's still there. And when you, especially when you translate these information into to the next step, to policy or to management, people are going to question that, right?
Right. Oh yeah, they definitely do. So you brought up a number of issues, and there's a long answer to that. But I think the short answer is that we know animals move, and this is not the tool for many things. Like if I'm studying giant bluefin tuna, ROV sub is not the way to do it. Demersal fishes that are habitat associated, we know to some extent that they are linked to those habitats to some extent. That doesn't mean we're going to see them all when the big loud ROV comes flying up, but it gives us a better shot based on what we know a priori about the animal behavior. So you have to match the tool to the organism. What is their escape response? So this is a rosy rockfish. They drop down and hunker. So the odds are, if you have a forward camera and a down camera, and they see you coming, they're going to drop down to the habitat, but you're going to get them with a down-looking camera when you move over them. Other animals' primary escape response is going to be to bolt, and so we may never sample those well. So I think the best approach to get around some of your challenges is to understand them as much as we can ahead of time, and then sample as much as possible, because some of that's going to fall out in the noise. It also goes about how you lay out your transects. Fixed stations give us a very high probability of detecting change at particular locations, but for mobile animals, it's very problematic. So we randomize our transects around the habitats. We do a better job of capturing population dynamics in the vicinity, but we lose the ability to detect precise change. So it really depends on the question is, but those are good questions. Somebody back. Oh, yeah, okay.
Hey, my name's Ethan. I'm a Master of Forestry here, and my research has been on using drone-based images to study 3D models of timber plantations, and I was wondering if there's any work being done in the marine space on using these image-based methods to create 3D models.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and so one of the things, most of, like you see in this picture, we have old school, these are lasers. Those are 10 centimeter lasers that we use for sizing things. But a lot of us are moving into stereo video, which one gives us the opportunity to get better, much better sizing estimates for the animals we're sampling. But it also can allow us to create 3D models of the area we're transecting. But where we sample over the multi-beam, we have that three-dimensionality. And we can map, you can send an AUV out and take photos like with 20% overlap for several kilometers and mosaic them onto the habitat and get precisely those kind of three-dimensional stuff. It's very cool, it's time intensive, and it's good for really small areas, but absolutely. The thing the thing that's been evasive to date in the marine environment, at least the groups that I'm working with, is automated identification. That is a tough one. Much of the time, what passes as a fish is a blob that moves like this up in the upper hand corner of the video. And software's never gonna do that for you. So I think you still need eyes. But I think the inevitable march of technology will bring us further that direction. I think there was a question over here. Oh, you got it, okay.
Hi, my name's Tamara, I'm a PhD student. And I was wondering, you were talking about how you want to use science basically to facilitate more informed decision making,
yeah,
I guess. And I was wondering two things. One, if you thought about harnessing public opinion in a way by, sharing your information with the public and so on, and how that affects public policy. And the second question is if you've found, a good angle at how to get policymakers to listen to your message.
Right, so good questions. And yes, science communication is something I spend a fair amount of time on. We have an annual workshop in science communication for grad students in California in Monterey Bay Area that gets just at this. You need to train people. Humans have many different ways of knowing, and you really need to be nimble and be able to, you need to be able to describe your work in a peer-reviewed journal article. And I have traditional colleagues who will say, until you're tenured, just don't talk, right? Do your science and publish in your peer-reviewed journals. They think that the endeavor of science communication, particularly for students, is dangerous. But from my vantage point, you guys are going out into a world that's very complicated. And so some people know things by tradition, some by faith. A great number of people in this country know things by faith. Some people by reason, and you need to be able to tell that story to each of those different groups, nimbly jumping back and forth. And so I think the better poised you are to do that, so we're working on that all the time. As to the second question, I have yet to find the best approach. And one of the things I teach this class of grad students a couple weeks from now, we're going to be talking about coming at things, how you would approach things from an executive agency level versus a legislative track, or what would you do from a judicial direction? And the answer too is, again, you have to be nimble. There's no single way to do any of this stuff, and most of it is extremely frustrating. You think about the incomprehensible ecological complexity that we all deal with all the time, and the huge amount of uncertainty that results even from the best projects that we have. It's monumental. But then you marry that to the uncertainty derived from human choice, and things get really horrifying, right? Because you start to deal with people. The thought experiment I have my students do is close your eyes and think about the person who you've had the most difficult time communicating with in your life. Just think viscerally about how that made you feel and how challenging that was. Now open your eyes and realize you're sitting across the table from that person and you have to compromise with that person to achieve some management end. It was only 2.5 months ago I received a death threat in the middle of giving a talk. So people receive stuff in very different ways. And that is one of the central challenges. The longer I've been doing this work, the more I've realized that's probably our biggest challenge. I'm sure all you guys are doing extraordinary science, like many of the people who've sat in this chair before you and elsewhere around the country. But again, to return to that story, more science is not necessarily the problem, as you can imagine. If you watch things like the debates on Monday night, science isn't necessarily going to advance all our political discourse. Certain problems are tractable, and science can provide a real explicit information to answer specific questions. But the broader stuff, it becomes polarizing. And so we have to figure out how to work around that. In the American public, there's this dichotomy Scientists are still held up on a pedestal, but the science is debated frequently by people who have no capability to do it whatsoever. And that's a very interesting challenge to deal with. So there's no shortage of challenges, but I think that's the kind of stuff that gets me up in the morning, so I'm able to keep going. I have at least one former student/technician who's now a medical doctor. She looked at one too many mud transects from an ROV and said, "That's it. I can't do it anymore. I'm going to help people." And now she's helping people, and I take credit for that one too, because I spurned her from science, and now she's saving people's lives.
Hi,
Yes.
so I'm Ethan Adicott. I'm a second year MESC, and I'm from Miami, Florida.
Okay.
Born and raised.
All right. Yep.
So I know that a lot of the management decisions have involved like the Army Corps of Engineers and federal agencies.
Yeah.
So kind of based on your last response and kind of how you started the talk.
Yep.
Can you comment on how looking at characterizing the uncertainty and human impacts in the marine environment leads to maybe a policy decision that has us holding back on benefits in terms of like, I don't know, beach restoration or other projects?
Right. So again, so I reiterate, it's complicated, and that's not a good answer. That's kind of like our many answers in a political context. It's complicated, and the people's eyes roll back in their heads. I think you really need to spend a fair amount of time. This is the challenge I make all my grad students deal with, is I want to see the dendrogram that gets me from this is what you're doing for your thesis, and here's the big policy. Show me the dendrogram that gets you from you to the big picture. And think about credibly how it is that you get there. And most people think, okay, the first answer is I'm going to publish it in Science or Nature. Well, the reality is most politicians aren't reading Science or Nature. So the next question is, I'm going to give a talk at an important science meeting. True, but the stakeholders won't be there. So what you really need to do is start thinking about, okay, beyond the hand waving, as it were, like my work has clear application to marine protected areas, or clear application to fisheries management or forestry policy. What is it actually going to do? I don't like Lance Armstrong anymore, but my dad died of cancer and he was wearing one of these. And I pull this out much of the time because not everybody's going to cure cancer. In fact, no one has yet. But so you should be unapologetic about the contribution you're making to the bigger picture. Just know what that is and explore precisely how to work it. So, working with the Army Corps is going to be very different than working with NOAA. It's going to be very different than working with the EPA. So it behooves you to articulate what is the best path that you see, or in conjunction with discussions you've had with other people, and really think about how you would strategically place your information into that pipeline. And I think that's going to be variable. And the other thing, if you weren't already turned off, is it often depends on who's in the room at the moment. So much decision making is based on who's in the room at the moment decisions are being made. Entire decisions like why NOAA is in the Department of Commerce instead of the Department of Interior were made historically based on people that were in the room at the time. So it's, again, I know that a lot of traditional scientists tend to cast dispersions on people who do applied work. But I think the reality is that the applied work is orders of magnitude more complicated than any pure scientists have ever undertaken, because we expect you to nail the pure science, but then take that incomprehensibly more challenging step of applying it out there in the world. So I think you can hold your head up high, if you're not already, that, oh yeah, pure science, oh, that's pretty easy, huh? You just got to do your science and then go home. That's been my experience. Sure. Oh yeah.
Hi, James. My name's Lad Flock. I'm a staff member here at the school. I have a question about citizen science.
Yes.
So I can go to Cabela's or Bass Pro Shops, and for $1,000, I could buy a pretty sophisticated sonar system for my canoe or my bass boat or what have you. Yep. And I'm fishing up and down Long Island Sound, and I'm mapping the coves that I like and those kind of things. So I imagine on lots of little thumb drives or just gigabytes and gigabytes of people having all this interesting data.
Yep.
Can you give us an example of maybe some positive citizen science outcomes? Are you aware of any organizations that have harnessed the power of like that immediate coastline where you don't need a $100,000 side scanning sonar system?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I in no means intend to diminish citizen science at all, and I hope that's not the impression that you got, because I think there are applications where it's stronger than others.
No death threats here.
So I appreciate that. They actually asked me if I had one person came up after and said, do you have a permit to carry? I said, no, I'm from California, I don't carry a gun. So a couple examples come to mind. So I work with a group, this is first about citizen science, a group called California Reef Check. So it's a scuba diving approach, and you have to do rigorous training, both identification training, take tests, score particular levels, both in an exam in the classroom, demonstrate ability to ID and size in the pool, and then do it in the field before you get to enter any data. So I think the citizen science spans a whole scope. But I think an example to your point, as data that I saw when I was working in NOAA was really interesting. So whale watching vessels in the western Gulf of Maine go out and they target where the animals are going to be. So they're not doing regular transects, randomly distributed transects, but they have sightings data from decades of animals where they were. Now you don't know where they weren't from those data, but you know where they were. And what the sanctuary was able to do was to request a slowdown of vessels into Boston Harbor, came in on the trajectory, and to reorient the trajectory right between 3 peaks of humpback activity in summers for the last 30 years. I think that was a real success story that drives, whale watching is essentially citizen science. We're talking about non-trained people doing things that from which information results. And that was an example where, shipping, in discussion with the shipping industry, some behaviors were able to be modified in a fairly straightforward way to minimize interaction with the marine mammal. I think that was one example. I mean, there's lots of terrestrial stuff, like intertidal stuff and sandy beaches, where you can get people sensing marine debris along the beach. In California, you have something called beachcombers that does this really well. And I think there are obvious and exciting places to do this work, but just some of the things I think your idea, if we could put a sonar or any kind of data collection device on every kayaker who goes out and does things, in aggregate, we'd have some really interesting information. And I'm sure that's the future. Ecotourism and all kinds of different things, that's the future.
Thanks.
All right, James, another exhilarating talk. Thank you.